In this video we're going to go through and build a really strong Nema 23 linear actuator as an example build. You can see how if you combine these together you can make all sorts of machines. This uses the new Nema 23 threaded rod plate. It uses extreme solid V wheels, really strong, very rigid, and it's just a really simple build. So we'll go through and build this and hopefully it'll inspire some ideas. So let's get started. I'm going to build this using the 300mm lead screw, but of course you could build this up to say 1000mm if you'd like, and anywhere in between. This is just an example to get you started. The main thing to remember is to leave yourself about 20mm off the end with the lead screw here. See, on this end we're even. This end we're leaving about 20mm. And this will ensure that you have enough to go into, the coupling, the flex coupling here, and enough to go into the bearing back here, and that'll work out well. Okay, so let's get started. So we're going to start off with the wheels, and we're using the Extreme V wheels on here, the solid version. We're going to be using metric, so the spacers that you see here are all metric size, including the eccentric spacers that are on the top here. The small guys are 3mm spacers, and the taller ones are 6mm. So you can see we just added two of them here, the 3mm and the 6mm. So let's get started with the wheels themselves. Okay, so if you buy your wheels in the wheel kit fashion, it will come with everything you need to build them. However, since on this particular build we're using metric, we're not going to need the 1/4-inch spacer that comes with the wheel kit or the 25mm screw. We could save these for another project. I just want to make a note that on these wheel kits you do not have to go with the metric. You could use a 1/4-inch and an 1/8-inch spacer if you'd like, and it'll work just fine. On my particular build, I just wanted to make the whole thing metric, so I went through and switched all my spacers out for metric ones, and I also switched out the eccentrics for the 6mm instead of the 1/4-inch. But once again, you don't have to go that route. It'll work either way. What we're going to need is the 6mm spacer and 3mm spacers. So we're going to have those, and also if you'll notice here, you can see the 6mm spacer, the 3mm spacer, but you'll also notice that we have a very long run here, so we can't use the 25mm screws. We're going to have to go with 40mm screws here, and that'll complete that run. So just going to put a 6mm here, a 3 here, and that'll take care of that. Let's get started with the wheel build. Move these out of the way. First thing you want to do is press a bearing into the wheel like this. Put a shim in between, like you see there. Press the other bearing in. And a lot of times it's offset, like you can see in here. Sometimes if you put the screw in there, you can spin it and it will work its way even. And sometimes it won't, like this one. So you might need to get a screwdriver or something in there and kind of straighten it out like this. Okay, so that looks good. And we're going to go ahead and build all 4 of those, which we've already done. So these are all ready to go. Let's move on to the next step. Okay, in this section you're going to need 2 spacer blocks, 1 V-slot gantry plate, and 4 15mm M5 low profile screws. On this section what we're doing is we're basically building the plate up, and we'll add our wheels to the plate. You see the spacer blocks mounted here, and they mount with 2 15mm M5 screws into the block on each side. So let's get started with that. Get those mounted. We're going to be placing this on 20x80 V slot, so we're going to be using the holes out of the furthest out to the right and left of the plate. You can see that when you put these blocks on the bottom here, that this hole here lines up and this hole here lines up, and these are the ones that we're using to mount these on. Let's do that real quick. Now I'm leaving these a little loose just because I want to make sure that I get everything lined up, because the wheels also have to go through here as well. So I want to make sure we leave it loose so we have room for that. Same thing on the other side. Okay, so this looks good, and we'll go ahead and work the wheels on next. Alright, so on this plate we're going to add the wheels. On one side we'll be using the wheels that just have the standard spacers, the 6 and the 3 millimeter, or 1/4 and 1/8 if you're going with the standard. The other side we'll use an eccentric as well as a 3 millimeter, and I'll show you on the example here. Okay, so you can see on one side of the plate we have the 6 millimeter and the 3 millimeter, and then on the other side we have the adjustable eccentric as well as the 3 millimeter. And that's just the spaces off high enough so that we can get our nut block underneath there and everything lines up nice and even. So we'll work with this side first, and we'll do the normal spacers side first, and then we'll do the eccentric side next. So over here I have the 40 millimeter screw because we're going through the spacer block and everything like that. It's going to be a longer run. Just slide that through like this. I'm going to put my 6 millimeter spacer on, and then my 3 millimeter spacer, the wheel. Once again, you may have to spin it, and then nylon lock nut. I'm going to tighten this down a little bit, but not over tighten it. Make sure everything lines up good and it rotates good. You don't have a bad bearing or anything along those lines. I still have a little bit of movement here. I'm just going to push this down. And at this point, I think it's safe to tighten down our 15 millimeter screws and kind of get it set up like that. We'll go ahead and install the next wheel on this side, which will also have the exact same spacer, so it's the same way. Let's do that now. Okay, so we'll run through this one more time. 40 millimeter M5, 6 millimeter spacer, 3 millimeter spacer, the wheel, nylon M5 lock nut. Tighten all that together. This time I'm going to tighten this down a little bit and give the wrench a turn, make sure it all works. Go back to this side, which we left loose, a little loose. Tighten it down. And that is a really nice set of wheels mounted on there, really strong. There's no movement whatsoever. Okay, so now we'll work the next side. Okay, so for this one, basically the same thing, 40 millimeter screw. And then the difference being that we're going to be using this eccentric, 6 millimeter eccentric in place of the 6 millimeter normal spacers that you see there. So slide this in with the flange facing in, and it just goes down in the groove there. Kind of see if you turn this how it moves the screw around. And I like to face these out away from the center. You can see the little notch there, just so that I know when I go to put the rail in there, it'll go in there easily and I can adjust this to the rail. Next is our 3 millimeter spacer. And then our wheel. And then the nylon lock nut. Now these I'm going to tighten, but I'm not going to over tighten these because we still have to adjust this eccentric later. So just barely snug it. I'm going to move this back here. You can see there how that is. And I'm going to go ahead and, now that I have this one in here, once again I'll tighten up the 15 millimeter lock spacer block screws. That looks good. And we'll repeat the same process for the next wheel. Okay, that looks good. We have both on, and once again I did not over tighten these. They are snug, they're not moving, but I didn't over tighten them. I made it so that I can still spin this eccentric and move this wheel around, which is exactly what we want to be able to do. That looks good. Let's move on to the next step. Before we get started on the next step, which is installing this nut block onto the plate, we want to run this lead screw into the nut block and kind of knock out any debris or anything that might have built up in there. If it shows up on the camera, these ends have been ground down and sometimes they just spin out and they don't want to grab, so you have to kind of push them in there a little bit. I'd like to get that started, and one of the ways you break it in is you can actually chuck it into your cordless drill. Lightly chuck it in there, so don't crank down on it a lot. You might even want to put a little cloth in there or something, but I haven't found the need for that. And then we're gonna turn this and kind of break it in back and forth. I'll put this drill on high. Another thing you could do is add a little bit of a spray lubricant, like silicone spray or something. You can see it's kind of working its way in there and it looks a lot better now. So do that a few times. Make sure you get a nice, smooth, easy to spin nut block on the lead. I'm going to get some lubricant and put it on there. So I have a little bit of liquid wrench here. I'm just going to spray a little in there. And then run that through again. And just flip it over once in a while, do the other side. Alright, that looks pretty good. So that's what you're after. You kind of have to seat it. And what's nice about this is it'll keep this nut block nice and tight on there to eliminate any backlash that might occur. So that's good. We have a nice fit between our lead screw and the nut block. Just make sure that we can manually put it in there, and we can. That's really nice. This back off and we'll work on to the next step. Okay, so in this step we're going to install the nut block onto the plate. You're going to need two 15mm M5 low profile screws and two M5 nylon insert lock nuts. So you'll notice that on the nut block it has recesses here for the actual M5 nut. So you can slide those in. They capture them so that you can put the screws through the plate into the M5 nut. And you're just going to line it up with the two holes here, here and here. And hand tighten it first. And I like to tighten these down a little bit and then back off on them because we want to leave this loose a little bit as we work with it. And you can see I left it loose. And that is what you're after right there. Okay, let's move on to the next step. Okay, now that we have the nut block on the plate, we're going to set this assembly to the side. We're going to bring the, in this case, 20 by 80 millimeter V-slot, and we're going to slide our assembly onto the rail. Now make sure that your eccentrics are facing out away from the rail, and you should have a little bit of play there. And you want to take your 10mm wrench and just setting the plate on the table. I'm going to turn these a little bit just until the wheel sets itself into that groove, and I get a little bit of friction here when I try to turn them. Do the same one with this one until they're about even. It's good. I can wiggle it and there's no movement whatsoever, and it's nice and smooth. So now I can tighten the whole wheel assembly. Make sure you're still smooth, and make sure that there's no movement whatsoever. As you move it around here, it's nice and tight, and it is. That's a really nice smooth gantry there. And I take the silicone spray and I spray it all over the wheels, on the bearings, and I just wipe it all into the grooves here, and just really get it on there and make it nice and smooth there. So this is what we're after. Let's move on to the next step. One thing I want to take time to mention is the size of the V-slot. In this particular case, it's 280 millimeter. And if you take your lead screw, 300 millimeter lead screw, have it flush on one end and look at the other end here, you should have about a little over 20 millimeters. That'll give you enough room to ensure that you go into the coupling as well as into the bearing back here. As long as you're in there, this piece here of the V-slot could be 500 millimeters, it could be up to 1,000 millimeters, but you just have to make sure you cut it a little bit shy so that you have enough here, a little over 20 millimeters, so that you have enough to fit in both ends. I've already cut this down to length to the 280 millimeters, and this should do the trick. So let's move on. Okay, on this step we're going to work on the V-slot a little bit. What we're going to end up doing is putting our Nema 23 motor mount plates. We're going to mount them right to the ends here. I'm going to use these end two holes here on each side. I'm going to use self-tappers to do it. So I'm going to need 4 of these self-tappers, and I'm going to go ahead and take a little bit of my liquid wrench, or if you have some cutting oil would be better. Just going to spray a little bit in these two end holes. And get this plate out of the way. I'm just going to take the self-tapper and I'm going to, using my drill on low, I'm going to run it back and forth a few times. Just like that. The other side here. And all I'm doing is, as I drill it in here, if it starts to get tight, I just stop and hit reverse. Right there it's a little tight, I'm reversing, back up a little bit, and then go back forward and get some speed and go a little bit deeper. Alright, that's good. And we'll go ahead and mount that on there. We're not going to put it in tight. So I have it on there and it's not tight, it's loose right now. Take another screw on the other side here. Back that off a hair. You still want to be able to work with this plate as far as moving it up and down. So one thing you might want to introduce at this point is a handheld screwdriver. Then you can fine tune these a little bit. We can now bring the cart over and introduce that back onto the system. Clean off any debris that you might have on the wheels or the rails. Should have a nice smooth motion is what you're after. When you hold one of these wheels, you can feel the friction being pulled against it. You can do the same thing on this side, and I can tell that one side is tighter than the other because I can hold this one. So I can back this eccentric off a little bit, just a hair, I mean, and that's nice. You want smooth motion, you don't want it to be a lot of friction, but you want it to be locked on for sure. This will give you a really strong gantry. Alright, so at this point the next move is to bring in the lead screw, and we're just going to thread this through a little bit. It's going to be a little bit tight, but just work it through until you get about halfway, something like this. Then we're going to move on to the next step. Alright, at this point you're going to need an 8mm lock collar, and make sure your set screws in but not through. You're also going to need the 8mm shim and the 688Z 16 outside diameter 8mm inside diameter bearing. Let's just slide the lock collar on first, slide the washer on, and I usually put the rounded side facing the facing the bearing, which will be next. Slide the bearing on. If it's flush, should be good. That's good. That's what you're after. And at this point, this one doesn't want to slide up any further. That'll be fine. So right there is where you want it. That looks good. At this point, I'm actually going to take and turn this lead screw a little bit more and bring this carriage back to almost touching this lock collar. Just something like that. And we're going to go ahead and tighten. Since we have this plate in position and it's the proper height, we can tighten down these back two screws here, and so that we'll set this plate so it's not loose. Okay, so I'm just going to go through and tighten that down. That's pretty good. And you could add more screws back here if you wanted to, 2 more for this particular V-slot size. Okay, that looks good. Let's move on to the next step. Alright, same as we did on this end, we're going to go ahead and slide the lock collar on. 8mm washer, shim, and this time we want to slide this down a little bit more, so make sure that you can slide this on here. If you have trouble, you might want to take a little bit of fine sandpaper and sand that down so you can get it to slide on. That's perfect right there. And we'll introduce the second plate. Make sure that the recess is facing on the inside. Put on the end 2 of our self-tapping screws. And since we've already gone through and pre-tapped these, we should be able to just thread them back in the holes. So I tightened it down, but it's, I'll loosen it back up. Once again, to get the proper height here, what we're going to end up doing is bringing this assembly forward. Let's go ahead and lift up the rod and put the bearing where it goes to set it. And then I'm going to bring this down here by turning this. You can chuck the drill onto the end again. I'll do it real quick. Just to bring it down. Okay. You can loosen this plate up a little. And just make sure that this sits where it should. Make sure your bearings are in, and then tighten the plate back down. And once again, you could add a couple more screws here if you wanted to, but you may want to do that. It's up to you. I'm going to back this off a little bit, and then what we'll do in the next step is we'll tighten down both of these set screws. Alright, so on this side I'm just going to tighten this down, pushing against the lock collar, and same thing on this one. Now, we have a little bit of movement here, and that is due to the fact that we left this loose to kind of let it find its own path. So now we can tighten that down. Now if you rock this back and forth, there should be no play. Very solid, no movement. This is the assembly. The only movement should be if you turn this lead screw. And that's really good. That's what we want. Okay, now we'll start to build the motor assembly off the end here, like you see on this one. Study that a little bit, and we'll get busy doing that now. Okay, for this step we're going to be adding the stepper motor onto the end of the actuator here, and you're going to need your flex coupling, which is 1/4 inch by 8mm, and you will need 3 40mm spacers, 3 55mm low profile screws, and 3 M5 nuts. So at this point, go ahead and we'll just slide the flex coupling on here. We're not actually going to tighten it down yet, we'll just leave it loose. Just going to go through and start with this top one, slide that through, put that on, and then decide where you want your wire orientation. You might want it to the left, to the right, you might want it facing out this way. I'm going to face mine down, probably to the back like this, and just slide that in. Put one of the nuts on the back. I'm going to spin this whole assembly around, it'll be easier for me to work with. Start them off by hand. Get your wrench, 8mm. Okay, so something like that. Looks pretty good. And we're just going to go through and add the rest of these. These I'm going to have to probably start with sliding the spacer in there first and then sliding the screw through. Just like that. Put the nut on the back and tighten that down. I went ahead and moved this gantry plate down to the end. Just makes it a lot easier to get your screwdriver in here. Go ahead and finish tightening these down. Alright, so we have one more. Slide the spacer in. Line it up. Screw in there. Go ahead and tighten this one down as well. Alright, once that's complete, our last step here is to tighten down our flexible coupling, and what you want to do here is leave yourself a little bit of space just so the plate and the coupling itself is not rubbing. So just leave a little gap there. Alright, and that, make sure your connector here, plate should be moving. That looks awesome. We're super tight. Nice strong gantry. And that's the completion of the Nema 23 linear actuator. Really simple, quick, and inexpensive build. I think you'll appreciate the amount of power and precision that you can get out of this system. You could see how you could incorporate two of these systems to make an XY system. A very powerful XY system. You could even incorporate it this way. There's multiple possibilities and opportunities for this actuator. Please be sure to check out OpenBuilds.com for fresh, new, exciting builds. I hope you enjoyed watching. Thank you and happy building.